Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Community Relations Corner, where we discuss issues of concern to New York's Jewish community and our friends and partners and neighbors all over the city and the metropolitan area. I'm your host, Michael Miller, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. And on each episode of Community Relations Corner, we are joined by guests representing the political, religious, economic, and diverse community leadership of New York, many of whom I've had the honor of getting to know over my long tenure here at JCRC-NY. Together, we're going to be exploring topics which span their interests, backgrounds, and current events impacting New York's Jewish community and its neighbors, as well as the state of our city, the state of our state, and the state of our nation. First, and sometimes the state of the world, but first a word of thanks from our sponsor. This episode of Community Relations Corner is sponsored by the Free Synagogue of Flushing, serving the Reformed Jewish community in Queens, New York for over a century. Visit freesynagogeflushing.org to view a 360-degree panorama of its magnificent stained glass sanctuary and immerse yourself in a piece of Queens Jewish history. All are invited to join for a wide array of programming and webinars, and the beautiful sanctuary, social hall, and meditation garden are available for rental to add to your joyous occasions. Visit freesynagogeflushing.org to learn more about their Shabbat services and weekly Sunday school. Once again, visit freesynagogeflushing.org. Thank you to the Free Synagogue and its president, Ed Shorter, and its cantor, Alan Brava, and we are honored to introduce our guest on the corner today, and that is the first Dominican American to be elected to the United States Congress, hailing from New York's 13th Congressional District, representing Upper Manhattan, particularly Washington Heights, where I spent too much of my life, and to welcome Congressman Adriano Espaillat.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I have known the congressman for a very, very long time. We won't give away our ages, but he's somebody who I consider to be a very dear friend, but most importantly, a dear friend of the Jewish community in New York. And Congressman, thank you for being here. Shalom and gracias. And we very much like to get to know more about you before we start asking some more serious questions, but we seriously want to know who is Adriano Espaillat? Where were you born? Where were you raised? And how did all those experiences contribute or inspire you to get involved in politics?
Well, thank you, Michael, first, and the JCRC for inviting me to this Community Relations Corner. As you said, we've known each other since my days at the New York State Assembly. In fact, I think my first trip to Israel was with you.
That's correct.
Back in the late 1990s. And so I value your friendship and your collaboration with me throughout the years. I'm an immigrant, like many New Yorkers. Came here as a young boy from the Dominican Republic in the late 60s, mid 60s. And was embraced by New York City. I have a lot of good memories of New York City as a child and an adolescent growing up in the city in the 60s and 70s. I think that the city was and continues to be an avenue to success and accomplishment to many, many people from all over the world. I remember, as I often say, I remember back in the DR, as a child, that we thought that the streets in New York City were paved with gold.
And guess what? The Jewish community.
Guess what? They were, because they gave me the opportunity to be a member of Congress, and they given so many people in so many avenues of New York City the opportunity for success. So I'm very grateful to New York City and to the different communities throughout New York City who usher me and help me get up and go, right? And so as a member of the immigrant community, I also became very much engaged in civic duties and public service, and eventually found my way to the State House in Albany and the State Senate, where I served for nearly 20 years before becoming, of course, a member of Congress.
Yeah. So was it really the immigrant experience which led you into politics? Was that the shoehorn?
I think it was a combination of things, that being perhaps the prominent reason why. I was around during the tail end of the Vietnam War. I remember going down to 42nd Street to enlist in the Army because you had the service back then that you had to do it. I was part of the last lottery for the Vietnam War just before it ended. Of course, the civil rights movement was still very much around. We had just gotten over an occupation and a civil war in the Dominican Republic. So all of those things mixed in together, in addition to my immigrant experience, I think made it almost impossible for me not to get involved in this.
Well, we're very glad that you did, and the role that you've been playing both in the State House, state legislature, as well as in the House down in Washington. But again, there must have been a significant change in serving as a legislator between dealing with New York issues up in Albany and in Washington, D.C., dealing with national and global issues. How was that transition for you?
Well, that's an interesting question, Michael, because I've always had a very special place in my heart for foreign politics, international politics, foreign policy. And to me, that was always like the big arena. It was like the major leagues, right? And so I was on AAA for about 20 years, and then I got a shot at going to the major leagues, where you discuss everything from the local issues to the international issues, which I think are so interesting and so complex.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was an opportunity to broaden my horizons and my understanding, and also to put out my vision out there as an immigrant from the Caribbean, from that third border of the United States, which is the Caribbean basin. I thought it was important for Congress and my constituencies to hear that side of me, and I think that, and of course, I got to Washington, and right there, Donald Trump was in the White House, so that, of course, changed everything because of the nature of what he's done and how he has approached this presidency.
So what do you view as the priorities within your portfolio since you've been in Congress in 2016 and through not only this presidency, but also local, national, and global events? What particularly have you focused on, particularly those issues, especially those issues that impact on your constituency? And it's a pretty broad constituency.
Well, first, I sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and within that, I sit in the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee. As such, it provides me the opportunity to speak about international matters from the Western Hemisphere perspective. And so I've been working to ensure that the Caribbean gets additional funding for the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative that will combat violence and drugs and the presence of terrorism, of terrorist cells in that region, and will provide us with a greater investment in that area that I call the third border. Also, how to address natural disaster. The Caribbean is on the pathway of the hurricanes. So how do we address those issues for the Caribbean Basin? That's one, right? And of course, sitting in that committee, I have to address my support for Israel, and the matters regarding the Middle East are also very prominent in that committee, and I've been, I believe, on the right side of those issues on an ongoing basis. Then I sit also on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee. Right. And one of my important projects is the second phase of the Second Avenue subway. And I see it not only addressing a major transportation desert in East Harlem, but also a great opportunity to be an economic engine that will bring jobs to local residents and that will train young people in transportation infrastructure jobs. In fact, Charlie Rangel and I are working on an institute at City College that will provide the training for future transportation infrastructure jobs for young people. Finally, the pandemic hit. So, of course, priorities quickly changed with the pandemic, and my district was hard hit by the pandemic, but I do have a lot of hospitals, probably more hospital beds than any other district across the country. I have Montefiore Hospital, Mount Sinai, New York Presbyterian, Harlem, Metropolitan Hospital, Northwest Bronx, and a healthy network of community-based physicians. But we also got hit, with very high numbers because my constituency suffers from diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular problems, respiratory problems, and we saw staggering numbers. And so I quickly worked with community leaders and healthcare leaders in putting together a network of discussion where we're going to see very soon a major mental health initiative, because I think there's a mental health component to this pandemic that we haven't really seen in its full scope. Fighting for more PPEs for local doctors so they can reopen their practices and begin to address prevention. In addition to that, fighting for ventilators and the hospitals that really were, and the healthcare workers that were the protagonists, they were the leaders in during this pandemic and help save lives. So we still got a long way to go because this pandemic is still very much out there, but that has been recently my number one priority.
Yeah, wow. So that's a lot on the plate. And I know that members of Congress have to have a very, very broad agenda to deal with, let alone all the other issues that come up as in the course of business in the House. But I want to go back and just drill down a little bit. Many of our viewers, listeners would very much like to know about the Second Avenue subway and what the projection is as to when it is going to stretch all the way up into East Harlem and that it be completed after all these decades.
Well, we've been successful in keeping and increasing the funding for the project, and the state has also put its share of funding for the project. But, the Second Avenue subway is joined at the hip for funding for the MTA as a whole. Right. So for that reason, I've ensured that we put the funding that the MTA had asked for in the CARES Act back at the beginning of the year when we passed that, and I make sure that it was included in the HEROES Act, I think $8 billion, right, to avoid a major deficit that will then, of course, impact the funding for the Second Avenue subway. So we've been successful in the first part. The money is there in the HEROES Act that we passed in the House, and I'm very optimistic that eventually that will be adopted and we can avert a major fiscal cliff for the MTA, and we could continue to push for the Second Avenue subway. Now, the Second Avenue subway is a regional project, Michael. It's not just a local project because it connects to Metro North on 125th Street. Yes. It connects to LaGuardia Airport via bus on 125th Street, and it will connect on the west side to ferry service off the Manhattanville development and Columbia University expansion there. So this is and of course it will reduce the number of strap hangers in the Lexington Avenue line, which is the most crowded subway line in the country. Right. And so these are critical issues, right? Yeah. I think it's an economic engine for East Harlem and the region as well. It will provide a good prevailing wage jobs for the young people that we're going to get trained at the Institute in City College. Yeah. Again, I hope that all that comes to fruition. I also see that you're on the House Small Business Committee. That's correct, yes. I failed to mention that one, yes. Right, and small businesses have been pummeled during the course of this pandemic. Even though, the CARES Act was passed, it is still a huge struggle for small businesses. I'm sure that's occupying a lot of your time, particularly in your district in Washington Heights. So many small businesses operate there. So how has that played into the priorities too? Well, we're very early in the pandemic. I think the first week of the pandemic, New York Presbyterian was gracious enough to give out a $10 million grant for small businesses. Over 600 local businesses got anywhere from $1,000 to $25,000 in grants to help address that. We still have a good chunk of that funding available for a second round. In addition to that, obviously, we were very, very active in making sure that our local businesses apply for the PPP program. Right. Over 6,000 of those businesses applied throughout the district. I know that in East Harlem, there's also another pot of money, close to $3 million that the Councilwoman Diana Ayala, was able to obtain for local businesses. And just recently, this past week, we heard from Google, which has got $5,000 grants for small Latino-owned businesses, and they will be taking the applications in, and training and coaching for those businesses as well will come in. So we're very active in that. I think that obviously there are many businesses, for example, the restaurant business that needs special attention because of the nature of the business. I think when it gets cold and they have to go indoors, they will suffer. So we need another round of PPPs. And I'm hopeful that will happen once we reach an agreement on the HEROES Act.
Yeah, well, we in the not-for-profit world also hope that there is.
That's correct. You are eligible. That's correct. Yes.
Another PPP. We were eligible last go around, and hopefully we'll be eligible again if it's put on the agenda. And I know that there's so many not-for-profits here in New York that have also been really taking a hit because philanthropy is challenging for those who take government dollars. We don't, but those who do, there are issues there too. But I want to go back to, you mentioned about the Caribbean being the third border. So I guess the second border is the border with Mexico.
That's correct.
Right? First border is the one with Canada, going from north to south. And immigration reform has to be one of your top priorities outside of your committee work. And what's been happening on the southern border has been troubling to many. So, and I understand that you went down to that border to see with your own eyes to investigate the allegations. So what did you see, and what kind of immigration policy do you think makes the most sense for the United States of America?
Well, what I saw there, Michael, was shameful. I saw women and children, for the most part, women and children, laying on a very cold, dingy floor in a huge holding cell. They look like packed sardines. Really an embarrassment for our nation, right? And how then, of course, those children were stripped away from their parents. My office was very active in reuniting parents that were 3,000 miles away from their children. We had a lady come from Arizona all the way to New York, Jenny, to join with her 2 children. And so this was a very sad time in the history of our nation. We saw how people were under the bridge at El Paso, Texas, at the crossing there. Yeah. And so we went down to see what was happening there. And of course, the inhumane conditions that immigrants seeking, many of them seeking asylum, fighting for their lives. Some of them have come through also because of environmental issues, because there was a horrendous drought in the Triangle region affecting the agriculture there, forcing mothers, for the most part, to travel thousands of miles through Central America to the border to seek refuge and save their life and their children's lives. Just recently, I traveled down to Irwin, Georgia, to visit a group of women that have been detained at that facility, the ICE facility, and have been subjected to medical treatment and operations that they really knew very little about, and hence were not given the proper orientation or knowledge about what, and therefore no legitimate consent. In 2 cases, women were subjected to hysterectomies. And in the other cases, they were submitted to very rough and aggressive treatment. One of them described them being treated as animals. And so we're trying to shut down that facility, which is run by a private entity. And we're trying to get Congress to take a look at the practices by the doctor that administered the exams.
And so what, from a policy perspective, particularly now since the Democrats have the majority in the House, what policy would you like to see implemented here to ensure that all these things that you have witnessed that are objectionable be addressed?
Well, first, we were successful. I was successful in allocated funding for a body camera program for Border Patrol. So to ensure that any interaction between Border Patrol and folks crossing the border is done in an appropriate way. It helps to protect the immigrants and also the Border Patrol agents. And so that's already in the system, and a pilot project is being put in place. It began already at the border. So the funding will address the body camera program for hundreds of Border Patrol agents and eventually ICE agents. But in addition to that, we want to see dreamers be brought in. That's really a no-brainer. It's a low-hanging fruit. These are young people that came in at a very young age. Some of them 1, 2 years old. They're doctors, they're teachers, they're small business owners. They own their own homes, many of them. They're very successful and they pay taxes, and they know no other country than America. And so many of them can't even speak the language of their home country. So we want those dreamers to be brought in. We want TPS, temporary protected status, also extended to those people that are fleeing for their lives from violence, from war-torn countries, from violent gangs, from natural disasters that put their lives and those of their family members in danger. So these are the first 2 actions that should be taken. Mm-hmm. But eventually we're going to have to do a comprehensive immigration reform act. And I think that the proposals are there in place that will help obviously put something together that will bring in those folks that have not broken the law, that will add additional value to America. You know, we're going to need these folks to recuperate. The economy has always been linked. The resurgence of the U.S. economy has always been linked with also the presence of labor, new labor force, in this case, immigrants that want to come in and help bring America to where it should be.
Yeah. Well, that's it's a very, very large agenda, but I think the immigration issue has just been looming for too many years. And I hope that over the course of the next year, many of the suggestions that you've put forward are looked at and hopefully legislated. And before we continue, I really want to thank again our sponsor. We wouldn't be able to have Community Relations Corner without sponsorship. And that sponsorship, of course, is with the Free Synagogue of Flushing, serving the Reformed Jewish community in Queens, New York for over a century. Visit freesynagogueflushing.org to view a 360-degree panorama of its magnificent stained glass sanctuary and immerse yourself in a piece of Queens Jewish history. All are invited to join a wide array of programming and webinars, and the beautiful sanctuary social hall and meditation garden are available for rental to add to your joyous occasions. I hope, Congressman, you get a chance to see the Free Synagogue.
We'll love to.
Your staff will go to freesynagogueflushing.org and take a look at the beautiful panorama of their stained glass. Visit freesynagogueflushing.org to learn about Shabbat services and weekly Sunday school. Once again, please visit freesynagogueflushing.org, and we thank you for your sponsorship, because otherwise you wouldn't have the pleasure of having Congressman Adriano Espaillat with us. And we're going to shift the focus now back. We spoke a little bit about the COVID-19 pandemic, and there really is considerable debate in Congress over how to properly address the pandemic, and even more challenges at home in terms of healthcare disparities. What policy changes do you think are necessary to help the American people through these exceptionally trying times?
Well, first and foremost, we're still in the middle of the pandemic. So you got to wear your mask, you got to wash your hands, you got to distance, you got to adhere to all the recommendations that the medical community and the scientific community are providing to us, because in the last few days, we've seen the highest number of COVID-19 positive cases throughout the pandemic. Many people think it's over, but the fact of the matter is that in the last 3 days, the United States of America has seen the highest number of COVID-19 positive cases since the pandemic began. So this is still very much moving forward, unfortunately. So we must continue to take the precaution to wash our hands, to socially distance, to wear our mask, and to take all the precautions that are being given to us by the medical and scientific communities. In addition to that, because of that, we have to continue to provide funding for our medical institutions. We got to continue to provide PPEs. We got to continue to help now community-based primary care physicians that are trying to open up in New York City. Those doctors that were shut down and were handling their clients, their patients through telehealth, are now trying to open up and address some of the pending medical conditions that their patients had, that for now several months have been unattended because of the pandemic. And in order for these doctors, if you take a look at the American Health Journal, there's an op-ed there today, published today, where I give the recommendations for local community-based physicians to be funded for their PPEs. The cost of the PPEs for these private practices has gone up. Many of them have taken new measures in their offices to install new ventilation equipment or to reshape their offices so they're in compliance with social distancing rules. So there's added expenses to these important doctors. They're in the trenches, they're in the front lines. Those are the doctors that are down the block from you, where most people go to before they go to the hospital. So we gotta help them. So these are the important things that we got to do. We got to continue to work on the vaccine. And once the vaccine is found, there must be an ethical way to distribute the vaccine. I think there's going to be, unfortunately, a scramble where the rich and powerful may try to muscle in and try to get the vaccine before anybody else. So there must be an organized and ethical way to distribute the vaccine determined by the medical and scientific community. Finally, Michael, I think this has obviously an economic tangent to it. And small businesses, as you said earlier, need to get additional help. They need to make sure that we have another round of PPEs, that we also give grants out to our small businesses, and that we usher them back to fiscal health. So these are the major challenges. One last thing, I mentioned that earlier, is there's going to be a mental health tsunami. Yeah. Because many people lost their loved ones without appropriately saying goodbye to them. Many people lost their job or shut down their business. People were fighting for their lives for 2-3 months in the hospital, or know someone that did that, or were sick themselves, or were just locked up in their apartments with their children for 2-3 months. And so the world is never going to be the same because of this experience. And I think there's going to be a mental health crisis emerging as a result of this pandemic, and we must address that as well.
Wow. Yes, very much so. But moving through this pandemic, we also saw the murder of George Floyd, which set off massive demonstrations here in New York and throughout the nation. And your constituency is certainly concerned about the behavior of our police, and sometimes the misbehavior of our police, and trying to balance that with their real concerns about safety, looting, rioting, and the lack of mask compliance. So how do you strike a balance between police protection and ensuring the safety of your constituency, of New Yorkers, as well as people across the country, making sure that neither of them are skewed out of proportion?
I think it requires leadership, Michael. And let me tell you, I know that very often the same folks that are saying that Black lives truly matter and that we want to see police reform are the same folks that say no to the looting, and that are also concerned about the quality of life issues that are emerging in our neighborhoods. And they shouldn't be mutually exclusive. I think that we can handle both of them. And in fact, I think there's room for a great debate, vigorous discussion as to how do we go about reforming the police in a responsible way that it won't compromise the quality of life that most New Yorkers want and need. I think that we can accomplish that, but it requires leadership. And I think there's been a lack of leadership in that terrain. We must make sure that the police refrain from aggressive tactics. We must do away with the knee. We must do away with the chokehold. We must do away with a culture of aggressiveness that unfortunately shows up in very negative and deadly ways. But we also must preserve the quality of life of our neighborhoods, because that's why people live in those neighborhoods, because it has a lot to offer them. And I think there's been a lack of preserving that as well. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think there are legislative proposals that will address both, and we should engage in a healthy discussion to ensure that we get there together.
Do you think that the atmosphere now is conducive to having that kind of a discussion? What would lead for that? It doesn't seem that enough of that has happened. I know that I've been in a number of conversations with neighborhood-based leaders and NYPD. They've been very, very constructive, including with the commissioner. And the people around the table are Black, some are Latino, some are Asian, some are Jewish, some are white Irish Catholic, let us say. I think much more of that needs to be done.
I agree. And I think that the JCRC could play a pivotal role because of the respect that you have across New York City. And I'll extend my hand, Michael, to join you. And let's come together. Let's all come together and have this discussion so that we can move forward together as one city. I think it's important. The city, is not in its best shape right now. I walk around the district. I go around the city. Sanitation services are practically in a bad state. The homeless crisis is just bursting through the seams. The school, our public school system, has attempted to get up and go, but I think it has been unfortunate because we have not seen the response from families, to send their children to school or to get on that distance learning approach. I think the success of it has been dismal. And so, and then of course, you have police community relations, which must be better. And so we have great challenges, perhaps greater than ever before. We yet don't know the kind of economic hit the city will eventually have from this pandemic. Public transportation, for example, needs lots of money so that it won't collapse and it'll be available to move working New York to their jobs when we do finally open up. So we got these great challenges that perhaps we haven't seen before in this magnitude, and we all gotta be on lockstep. We all gotta come together to make sure that we all ships rise at the same time.
Right, 100%. And dealing with neighborhood-based, let's look at part of your district and the neighborhood that you know so well, Washington Heights, and you have there a significant Dominican population, other Spanish-speaking populations, and you have a significant Jewish population, let alone having the institution that I spent, as I mentioned earlier, a good deal of my time at Yeshiva University. And I understand that you have a warm relationship with their president, Rabbi Dr. Ari Berman. How do you see opportunities on a local level for these two communities to work in partnership with one another? I know that up on Capitol Hill, you're a member of the Latino Jewish Caucus. Do we have something like that in Washington?
Not only a member, Michael, I'm the co-chair of it.
All right, they didn't tell me that.
I'm the co-chair of the Latino Jewish Caucus, and I wanted to be the co-chair because of the long-standing relationships between the Latino community and the Jewish community,
Yes.
particularly in Washington Heights. I think it has been a great experience, right, for the most part. And we battled common threats together. I remember when we had that bigoted white nationalist group, Europa, go up to Fort Tryon Park, just a couple of blocks from Dr. Roof's house, but also just a couple of blocks away from the Dominican immigrant community.
Yeah.
And so we came together at Fort Tryon Park, and we had the rabbis and the priests and the pastors there, and the families there, to push back on this group that all of a sudden just appeared there one day. Wow. To roll out this anti-Semitic and anti-immigrant message, and we all pushed back together. And so there's been this long-standing, tremendous relationship between those two communities that I felt compelled to take that kind of a spirit to Washington, right? Where I think it has also been very fruitful.
Yeah, well, I hope that the Latino Jewish Caucus in Washington finds a mirror image in Washington Heights of the Latino and Jewish residents of the neighborhood, because communication is really key. And you certainly have had a longstanding relationship with our community and can serve as a role model for bringing people together. And wherever JCRC can help, we very much.
Thank you.
There was an article, speaking about relationships, there was an article that was published in Jewish Insider about one of your colleagues kind of avoiding a relationship with the Jewish community. How do you understand the reticence to even engage with the Jews? Doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, as I said earlier, I reject any effort to not engage in a healthy discussion. Any move against tolerance, I reject. And I think the only way we could understand each other is by having a working relationship. And once we do that, we'll find so many things in common. For example, with the Dominican community and the Jewish community, what we found was the story of Sosua, right? Which is
I wanted to ask you. I want to make sure that our listeners know about Sosua, but many of them don't.
Yeah, well, Sosua is a small coastal town, a great beach, right? Great palm trees, where the Dominican Republic allowed the first Jewish members that were fleeing the Holocaust to settle.
Right.
And so there they built this wonderful community, and they proved to be very successful. And of course, many of them now, some of them still live here in the United States. And so the story was somewhat known, but not really known about many people. And finally, we were able to go down there and find some of the artifacts and the history of it. And eventually that led to a major exhibit called Sosua Island Paradise at the Holocaust Museum. Really? And so if you go to Israel and you go to Jerusalem, if you go to the Holocaust Museum, there's a tree planted there for the Dominican Republic because of its leadership in being the first country that allowed the victims of the Holocaust settle there.
And so, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem that our missions have gone to, and I've been to probably 100 times, but I've never seen it, and I've got to find it. Next trip.
Yes. And so because of that, right, and I was privy to that because I had friends, Dominicans of Jewish descent, that had given me the opportunity to read about the story. We brought that to New York City, and it served to be a bridge and further solidify the relationship between Dominicans and Jewish folks. And so this is the kind of partnership that I look to engage in, and anything else I will reject. And I think that there's room for everybody. We must have a big tent approach to our politics and our government.
And thank you. And we thank your birthplace, the Dominican Republic, for its embrace of the Jewish people during the course of the Holocaust. It probably was one of the only, if not the only, countries in the world that accepted refugees escaping from almost certain death.
That's correct.
And they were able to come to a country, foreign country, and to be accepted, to be warmly welcomed, and to achieve the success that they did achieve. And I look forward to seeing my next trip to Jerusalem to take a look at in Yad Vashem for that tree.
But you know, on my way there to find the tree, Michael,
yes,
I ran into another tree for Raoul Wallenberg.
yes.
And there is a park right near Yeshiva University, which is called the Raoul Wallenberg Park. So I was familiar with that story as well. Yeah. And it was like, it was just incredible. But and if I remember correctly, it may have been on your trip that I saw that when I went with you many years ago.
A long time ago. Let's not talk about it. But it was a great trip, and I think it was a very unique trip actually that you were on at the time. And speaking of Israel, you're a busy guy. So not only all the committees that you serve on, plus the Latino Jewish Caucus that you co-chair, but you're also a member of the Democratic Israel Working Group. So
that's correct.
Maybe you can share with our viewers something about what it is that you've been able to do within the framework of that group, and maybe what has hindered you due to the current polarized and polemical environment that we're currently in.
Well, first, we reject BDS and anything that has to do with that, and we look at legislation that could be helpful and consensus building. For example, as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I've led the way with members from across the aisle, from even the Republican Party, to enact laws that would diminish the possibility of the presence of a Hezbollah in Latin America and the Caribbean, because we've seen how Hezbollah has now extended its tentacles, not just across the Middle East, but now there is a presence in certain countries of Latin America and in the Caribbean. And so we have stiffened their sanctions against them, and we work in that arena. But we take a look at every piece of legislation that could have a positive or a negative impact on our relationship with the State of Israel, and we act upon it. And I think that that's been very fruitful. Irregardless of whether people may agree or disagree with us, I am very confident that we have the higher moral ground on those issues, and I will continue to pursue them.
Yeah, and we're very concerned regarding the potential for violence on that northern border, on the Lebanese border. Lebanon is a very volatile country right now. The battles between the Shiites and the Christians, the Maronites, and everybody else in between. So what Hezbollah might do is something that the United States of America should do everything that they can to prevent. And so the work that you're doing is really crucial.
And not only do we take a look at Hezbollah individually, but who funds Hezbollah, I think, is a critical issue. And all indications are that Iran, for example, is one of the biggest enablers of Hezbollah. And so we're concerned about that. And that's an area that I believe was left out of the agreement. It should have been a stronger agreement. And that was one aspect that was left out, our ability to monitor and hold accountable Iran and its funding of terrorist organization continues to be an important issue for me.
Right. Thank you very much for that. Before I ask my next question, in the interim, I received a text from one of our senior staff members who was a Peace Corps volunteer. Mary was a Peace Corps volunteer and was in Sosua as a volunteer. She says it's a beautiful town on the northern coast, and she knows the story very well. So we're bearing it out. My own staff knows about it. Okay, so a major success in diplomacy that the Jewish community points to nowadays is all the peace treaties between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain. As a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, how do you view the development both for Israel and for the United States, and what might happen down the road?
Well, I think that we could safely say that any time two countries that had a belligerent or intolerant relationship come together and put that aside, it's a step forward. But much more needs to be done. We must take a look at Saudi Arabia and their practices, their internal practices, very heavy-handed, over the top. So that is a particular interest to me, as well as, of course, Iran and their presence in the region and how they impact on stability in the region. So that's another major issue there. So we still have so much more to go. It's a step forward, but much more needs to happen. I think much more. We need to see what kind of commitment those governments had behind the agreement. And to ensure that they enforce the provisions of the agreement.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. And I'm very hopeful, as many members of our community are, that with Israel's establishing relationships with those two countries, that there's a potential for other countries to establish relationships with Israel as well. And I think that would add to the stability of a very unstable area of the world, and anything that can add to the prospects for peace is something that we should be supportive of. So I thank you for the role that you've been playing there. Just as a final question, all the issues that we talked about today, do you see any particular role for the Jewish community and our voice where it would be most helpful?
Well, I think that the Jewish community has played a very important role in keeping us informed, educated about these issues. And it's not a monolithic voice, right? It has different organizations that approach it from different perspectives. So I think that's also important, that we hear from the different voices and their views on how to move forward together in making sure that Israel is safe, that the state of Israel is protected, that terrorism is eradicated from that region, and that everybody could move forward. But locally, I think we need to continue, and also internationally, I think we need to continue to strengthen the bonds between Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Jewish community here in the United States and abroad. I think because there is a presence of members of the Jewish community in all those countries, right? And we can really benefit from that presence and strengthen our bonds. But I think that we need to ensure that the Latino communities understands these issues better, that they're active participants in making sure that the world and the Middle East is safer.
Yeah, and I think we also need to make it sure that we root out anti-Semitism wherever it rears its head. And we had a terrible spike in anti-Semitism prior to the pandemic. We're all very concerned once we beat this pandemic, which I'm confident that we will, that anti-Semitism and other forms of hate, not just against Jews, but hatred against others, is combated. And whatever role that you can play up on Capitol Hill, let alone to the communities in your district and who look up to you for the success that you've achieved, to ensure that we have bonds of friendship between all the ethnic communities in New York and the faith communities in New York, including the Jewish community.
I think it's important to combat anti-Semitism in any way, shape, or form, whether it's here locally or any place in the world. And you have my commitment to that. Thank you, Michael.
You have my commitment to maintaining our friendship over these decades. And I can't thank you enough, Congressman Adriano Espaillat, for joining us on Community Relations Corner today. It has truly been a pleasure to have you here, to host you. I'm going to conclude with a message of thanks again to our sponsor, and think about your last line to us. We're going to call on you again after I finish reading my message about our sponsor and give you the last word. So here we go. This episode of the Community Relations Corner is sponsored by the Free Synagogue of Flushing, serving the Reformed Jewish community in Queens, New York for over a century. Visit freesynagogueflushing.org to view a 360-degree panorama of its magnificent stained glass sanctuary and immerse yourself in a piece of Queens Jewish history. All are invited to join for a wide array of programming and webinars, and the beautiful sanctuary, social hall, and meditation garden are available for rental to add to your joyous occasions. Visit freesynagogueflushing.org to learn about their Shabbat services and weekly Sunday school. Once again, please visit freesynagogueflushing.org, and the last word goes to the Congressman.
Thank you, Michael. I want to thank you and the JCRC, and in particularly, I want to thank my Jewish constituency, Yeshiva University, of course, being among it, as well as all the Jewish communities across the district for the great friendship and support that they're giving me. And I just look so much forward to working with you as we go towards the future, united as one community. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Adriano Espaillat. We thank our audience for joining us live, or those who'll be seeing us once it's posted online. I'm Michael Miller. I'm the Executive VP of JCRC New York, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Community Relations Corner. Shalom. Goodbye.